Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going to go over my round 1 game from the 2019 World Open. The World Open is one of the biggest open tournaments in America. Well, actually it is the biggest, and typically it draws many players from all over the country and also all over the world, or at least it used to. It used to be the biggest open tournament of the year, happened in over the July 4th weekend, and was just a huge event. And it was also a really great sort of congregation of players from all over the country that would come and hang out and, you know, play in the Skittles room and do all these really awesome things. But in recent years, the World Open has changed a little bit because the younger generation is really intent to analyze with the computer and, you know, not really socialize as much. And as a consequence, it's not quite the same tournament it used to be, but it still is an interesting event to participate in. And unfortunately, fewer players from around the world are competing. There used to be delegations that would come from India or Russia. That's not as much the case now, but it's still a fairly strong event. Now, being that it's an open tournament, you know, you are prone to playing down a few rounds at least, and you have to kind of do your job, and then hopefully you get to play up. And so in round 1, I was paired seriously down against an individual by the name of Chen. And this guy was actually only 12 years old and rated about 1900 FIDE. And whenever you're playing these young players, you have to be really alert because typically their FIDE ratings haven't actually caught up with their actual playing strength because there aren't as many FIDE rated tournaments. Not every tournament is FIDE rated, so, you know, a lot of times, you know, they can be grossly underrated, and so I had to be really alert in this one and not take it for granted, and so I tried to bring my best to round 1. Anyways, I was white in this one, so let's get into it. I opened with d4, Max went knight f6, I played knight f3, and then he went g6, and already here I have to I'm at a bit of a crossroads because, you know, black can essentially go for a King's Indian, which putting the pawn on d6, or he can go for a Grunfeld by putting the pawn on d5. And the problem is I really had no idea which one he would choose. At the World Open and a lot of tournaments, at open tournaments in America, unfortunately, you actually don't get the pairings until literally a few minutes before the game. So it's nearly impossible to do any meaningful preparation against an opponent. So you pretty much just have to roll with the punches and just, you know, kind of take stock of whatever surprises you may experience, because you're going to experience some. So I was pretty much trying to decide here, okay, is it going to be Grunfeld or King's Indian, and how am I going to respond to it? And one of the things that I tend to do at times when I'm playing younger players especially is not to try and get into a theory battle with them, because a lot of times they've grown up, especially this younger generation, just using the computer. And so a lot of times their opening strength is really high, but their positional and strategic strength is not as high. And so I decided to play a fairly harmless line with e3 in the attempt to just get a position and make it more about strategy than anything else. After e3, Max went bishop g7. I went bishop e2, castles, and you could see very modest setup for white, but I just didn't want to get anything too critical from the jump. Now Max actually went d5, and that actually told me, okay, he's a Grunfeld player. He's really intent on playing the Grunfeld and not the King's Indian pushing the pawn to d6. And frankly, I was quite happy that I didn't go for a theoretical Grunfeld, because a lot of times the lines there can, you know, the first new move can be on move 25. And so to get into that theory battle with a really young player is not advisable. And frankly, you might say, well, aren't you a young player? Well, actually, no. I think I've said this before and someone chuckled about it, but you know, I actually am like a senior citizen when it comes to a lot of these tournaments these days, because the talent in the game has really shifted well into the teens, and I'm in my mid-20s, so I'm actually quite an old player, a veteran, if you will, on the tournament circuit, and I'm not young anymore. That's something I've just had to come to grips with, unfortunately. Anyways, after d5, there are different ways you can play the position. You can play not there. You can play c4 and push the c pawn like that. But I think black has adequate play after c5. I think I have c4, c5. Black has really active play in positions like this, and I wasn't sure I wanted to go into a line like this when I didn't know so much of the consequences. But I believe black has really good play for this pawn sacrifice. I've not done extensive analysis on it, but I think it's playable. In any case, if he isn't intent on, he also can take on c4 as well. So I just thought there was many different lines that black can play if I play with c4, and I wanted to get more of a strategic type of setup where it was a little bit more cagey, and so I went for the move b4. And this line I've actually never played before, but an old buddy of mine from England by the name of John Cox, an international master there, I remember seeing him play this system one time when I played the London Chess Classic Open tournament. I believe it was in 2016, and I stayed at John Cox's house with a few buddies of mine from North Carolina. And I remember John playing this line against a Grandmaster and, getting a very reasonable position. So I thought, you know what, maybe I'll give it a try. And the idea here with b4 is that you just clamp down on the c5 break and kind of make it difficult for black to kind of lash out in the center. And then if black really does nothing, you're going to slowly build with bishop b2, knight bd2, and c4 eventually, but you're taking away the c5 break from black. Now, one of the other merits of the system is that if they try to go a5 to undermine the b pawn, you actually can push b5. And the idea is that by pushing the a pawn, he maybe created some weaknesses on the b file, specifically the b6 and b5 squares. And if you challenge the pawn on c6 again, I may have this diagonal to work with bishop a3, and sometimes the pawn on b7 winds up being a backward pawn because I might not take on c6, but actually keep this pawn tension and argue that if I play like a move like bishop a3, rook e8, knight bd2, and you capture, for instance, this b pawn is very weak. My rook will have the b file to work with, and I'll lash out with c4 and get rid of my backward pawn and have a central pawn majority that is more favorable for white. So that's pretty much the gist of things. Now, of course, black has the opportunity to challenge white in this setup, and the move that actually I believe had been played the most was b6. So I think the idea is just to sort of prepare c5, and the thing that you have to look out for is that this rook on a1 is kind of loose. So tactically, if you're able to play c5 and force white to capture with the d pawn, all of a sudden the bishop screaming down that diagonal will get at the a1 rook. And so, yeah, Max played b6, and I had to think a little bit here. And I decided to play bishop b2 just to ensure that now if c5 is played, I can consider recapturing multiple times, and my bishop is challenging the one on g7. And now, actually, the position is actually not that popular in the database. I checked the database before looking at showing this game to you, and I saw it was only played in the database like maybe 12 or 13 times, something like that. So this position is already relatively foreign, and not many games here. But the move that was most popular in this position was actually bishop b7. And I think the idea is just to continue developing, reinforce the d5 pawn, and then I believe the plan would be to go knight bd7 and eventually c5. And, once you prepare this break, black tends to equalize. Even in circumstances where the d pawn might be isolated, it's not a huge issue because it can be reinforced with e6. And so I believe black is doing pretty okay here. Max opted for another choice, and it was the move knight e4. And the idea with knight e4 is that now the pawn on d4 is actually pinned. So c5 is kind of a threat because I can't recapture twice on c5 because my bishop on b2 is challenged. And yeah, it's a very interesting move. The reason that I wasn't a huge fan of it, though, is I thought that in some lines the knight on e4 was a little sensitive, and I might be able to challenge it with tempo, because in many lines you don't want to recapture the knight on e4 with d takes e4 and give yourself these double pawns on the e-file. So I thought knight e4 was interesting, but it was also a little bit double-edged from the standpoint that, it either equalizes or it doesn't, and you have to be very, very precise. In this position, you can play a move like knight bd2, which kind of gets at the idea I was considering challenging the knight right away. But the reason I ultimately disregard this move is because after knight takes d2, queen takes d2, c5 is possible. And again, there's this problem on the diagonal with my bishop on b2. And I can take on c5 once and then go c4 myself. But in this type of position, you can see that things are getting liquidated, and, as more pieces come off the board, it's going to be very difficult to prove any type of advantage here. So I was thinking, okay, maybe white is ever so slightly better because my rooks are connected and I have more development. But if black maybe plays bishop b7 or bishop g4 and makes a few more trades, I was not totally confident that I would have great chances here. So instead of knight d2, I actually opted for the move c4, challenging the d5 pawn. And my idea was that now that the knight on f6 has left the protection of the d5 pawn, maybe it's a little bit more sensitive than before. Black now went c5, which is actually a really good reply, and I didn't, really consider this one, but it's actually really logical to kind of keep this tension here and encourage me to take on d5, because frankly, if I take on d5 and queen takes, this queen is actually quite secure here, in part because the knight on e4 prevents me from going knight c3 with a tempo. Black would simply exchange and, basically have no problems in a position like this and, continue developing with bishop b7 and so on. So actually, keeping the tension with c5 is actually really logical. And again, I mean, this individual is 1900, but playing pretty well. And that's the case with juniors. You have to be very, very alert because especially if you're playing in the U.S. sometimes, because they can be grossly underrated. Now, I will say Max Chen was from Canada, but I'll say juniors all across North America are seriously underrated because there are not enough FIDE-rated tournaments for them. Whereas when you're playing in Europe, nearly every tournament actually winds up being FIDE-rated, and so there's actually more of an accurate depiction of your playing strength. Anyways, after c5, again, I said c takes d5 was not so attractive, and I was a little bit reluctant to play b takes c5 because we have that similar type of liquidation in the center. So I decided to try to keep the tension myself with the move knight c3. And knight c3 has the dual purpose of challenging the pawn on d5, but also the knight on e4. So, if black tries to reinforce the pawn on d5, I'm going to take on e4 and inflict double pawns on black structure. For instance, if e6, knight e4, d4, all of a sudden I believe white would be, doing pretty decent. But yeah, it's just another position. So, anyways, maybe knight e4, d4 is not so bad because the d4 pawn is hit. I'm looking here, and after knight e5, maybe f6 traps my knight, because after knight g4, there's h5. So maybe it's not as clear as I thought. Maybe there are some tactics here that allow black to have these double d pawns, but I thought that I might have something in this position. And at the very least, maybe I can take on d5 first. And then the point is, in this version, now if I go knight e5, f6 is not a possibility because there's bishop c4 check. So, and of course, bishop e5, d5 would be disastrous because now white would have the two bishops in a very promising position. So anyways, those were some things that I was looking at, and so I went knight c3, and black probably, made the right move playing knight takes e3, resolving this tension now because I was challenging that knight. But after bishop takes c3, black made a mistake. And Unfortunately for him, there was really no going back after this mistake. It was a fairly critical issue. The best move in this position, or one of the more playable moves, is actually just playing d takes c4. And again, because my bishop on c3 is, kind of stuck and unprotected, d takes c5 is not possible. And so I can't actually capture twice on c5, and black can initiate a liquidation with bishop g4 and just take advantage of the fact that my bishop on c3 is pinned. So, h3 might happen. And there's a very important intermediate move, not bishop takes f3, which would actually be a bad move, because after queen takes f3, now the rook on a8 would be hit, and I would still maintain the two bishops. But instead, the move actually after h3 would be c takes d4. Very instructive. And now the point is that the c3 bishop is actually hit. So if I take on d4 now bishop takes d4, and after e takes d4, I have an isolated pawn on d4, and now bishop takes f3 is played. And the difference here is that after knight d7, the rook is not hanging. Black managed to trade a pair of bishops so that white doesn't have the bishop pair, and black is more or less okay here. Even though I have the bishop and he has the knight, he has the better pawn structure because I have an Isolani in the middle, so it's just equal. So that would have been the way to go to actually, try to liquidate with dc4. Another option, though, not as good, but another playable option would have been c takes b4. And the idea is that after bishop takes b4, knight c6, you actually hit this bishop again. And if I keep it on the diagonal here with bishop a3, I thought this would be a fairly promising position. My bishop is on a3. I can play rook c1. I have a central pawn majority. I thought, hey, this should be decent. But actually, after d takes e4, bishop takes e4, and knight a5, very important move, all of a sudden black is getting good counterplay on the c file, and will very quickly come up with rook c8 and bishop b7, and it'll be difficult for me to mobilize my pawn majority in the center because he's going to have good control of the light squares. Note that if I play a move like bishop d3, now bishop b7 is very playable, and you could just see that black is fairly active on this diagonal. We'll bring a rook to c8, probably go queen d7, and not really have serious problems here because the knight on a5 is always threatening to jump into c4 and get some counterplay. So, so there were basically two ways to kind of, resolve some of the tension in the center and, favorably, and take advantage of my bishop on c3 being not an excellent piece. But instead, Max decided to keep the tension a little bit longer with the move knight c6. And unfortunately, it's just one move too late. The reason for this is now I actually have a very, very unique tempo gainer with the move b5. And all of a sudden, this knight on c6 doesn't really have a great square to go to. The issue in the position is that if you play knight a5, trying to get the knight to the rim, pressure c4 now, I have the amazing resource bishop takes a5. And after b takes a5, not only are these pawns doubled, you'd say, well, doesn't black have the two bishops? Isn't this kind of okay for black? Well, the issue is here I can play the promising d takes c5, sacrificing an exchange. And after bishop a1, queen a1, I have a really, really nice position here because I'm going to have a protected pass pawn on c6. And so, even though I'm down an exchange here, I've got a pawn for it, a protected pass pawn on c6, and also these pawns are extremely weak. And so this position would be actually close to winning for white and not advisable. And so, because you can't go to a5, there's really no good square for the knight. Note that if you start with c takes d4, e takes d4, it's the same basically situation with knight coming back to b8, because if you go knight a5 now, I could take on a5 and go c5, and again, even though black has the bishop pair here, I have a monster pass pawn on c6, so this is just not advisable. All of a sudden, it's a position where, after b5, black's in real trouble. Now, after b5, c takes d4 was played, and after e takes d4, knight b8 was played. He didn't go for knight a5, and he kind of acknowledged that the knight did not have a path forward. But the issue here is now he's actually seriously behind in development because he lost that tempo. And all of a sudden, I'm very close to connecting my rooks and initiating some play. And the other thing that's quite annoying is this pawn on b5 really dominates this knight on b8 now, and so it's going to have a hard time actually getting into the game. So I started with the move knight e5, and this move already makes it kind of uncomfortable for black, because if you try to go knight d7 to develop, all of a sudden I have knight c6, and this queen on d8 is lacking squares and e7 is hit. So now queen e8 would have to be played, and this position just is not pretty at all. So that's a huge problem. You can't go knight d7. And now with knight e5, I'm threatening ideas like bishop f3, trying to get onto this diagonal and take advantage of the rook on a8. There's sometimes queen b3 lining up on f7. And of course, bishop takes e5 is not a move you want to play because you give up the two bishops in an open position, which spells serious trouble. Now, knight e5 was actually not the best move. A better move actually would have been to start with rook c1. And the point is that if black tries to undermine the b5 pawn with a6, now I can actually reinforce with a4. And the point is that after an exchange, I actually get to keep pieces on the board, which actually helps me continue to play with my initiative. The other thing is that now with the rook on c1, c5 becomes a threat, again trying to get that protected pass pawn, and you can see the rook is actually protecting the bishop on c3, so I don't have those issues that I had in other lines where my bishop is loose. So knight e5 is good, but rook c1 was better. After knight e5, bishop b7 was played, trying to cover the c6 square with the bishop and develop a little bit, have a little bit more of a stronghold in the center. And now I went queen b3, and my idea was just to discourage this knight d7 move and to put more pressure on this diagonal. Because now if knight d7, I was thinking I might be able to play knight c6 or take on d5 and just get more pressure there. Now it turns out that again rook c1 is a better move, and not queen b3, rook c1. And the same concept is that if a6, a4, and I've kept a pair of rooks on the board, and I have a lot of pressure on the c file. And actually now if a takes b5, I also can entertain c takes b5 and keep the pawns like this. And you can see these pawns are very, very strong, and my knight may come to c6 at some point. So getting the rook to c1 was really, really important just to kind of get at the sensitive c6 square. And that's why queen b3 is slightly imprecise, but white's still a little better. Now here's probably the critical position of the game, because now black pretty much has to respond really precisely to get a chance to fight for equality. And instead, Max took a step in the wrong direction. And the position was pretty much irreparable after this. The best move in the position, surprisingly, is actually knight d7. And the point is actually you have to develop at all costs and try to connect your rooks. And even if it means you give up the bishop pair. And actually the issue in this position for me is that after knight c6, I thought that my pawn on c6 was going to be a very, very dangerous pass pawn. But it turns out that after knight f6, it's not so easy to support it. And I can make a series of moves like rook c1, rook c8, queen a4. But after queen d6, black is actually going to try to just double rooks on the c file and attack the c6 pawn. And the real issue here is that my d4 pawn becomes a target in a lot of lines. So after I take on d5 and knight takes d5, yeah, I managed to keep this pawn on c6 on the board. I have the two bishops, a passed pawn on c6. But the issue is a lot of times just rook c7, threatening rook fc8. And if I go g3, rook fc8, bishop a6, rook d8, the issue here is that it's very difficult to, push the c pawn forward, and my d4 pawn is actually a real target for black's pieces. So actually the position is fairly close to equal because it's hard for white to improve here. Black has a really good blockade. And so yeah, basically, I think the conclusion is that my queen b3 move early on in this position, instead of rook c1, missed the mark. Because if I go rook c1 right away without queen b3, now if knight d7 is played, knight c6 is a lot stronger because my rook is already supporting the pawn on c6, and I actually can go to queen a4 right away. Whereas in the other lines we looked at, I went queen b3 and then queen b4, and I lost an important tempo and more mobilizing my forces. So yeah, just a little bit of a detail there, but very, very important, and was pretty much the difference in me having an advantage or, it being close to equal. Fortunately for me, after queen b3, Max did not play knight d7, I think because he was wary of this knight c6 move, and played bishop d takes c4. But now after d takes c4, I go bishop takes c4, and not only is knight c6 still in the cards if knight d7 is played, because now, I can probably reinforce the pawn on c6 with this one coming to d5, but also I have massive pressure on the f7 square, and it's just too much to handle. These threats are just too significant. Now, there's really no great way to defend f7, and the position is actually lost. But if you tried to play like a move like bishop takes e5 to cover the f7 pawn, radically by giving up the bishop pair, after d takes e5, I'm going to converge with rook a d1. And so if you like a move like e6, yeah, you've shut down this diagonal for the time being, but you've weakened a ton of dark squares. And after rook a d1, Black's probably not going to survive this. I mean, I can go bishop b4, invade here. I can maybe double rooks. Maybe I can swing over to the g-file. There's just too much play for white in this position. And note that if Black tries to get active with a move like queen g5, threatening mate, I can just play the very simple f3 and block out the bishop on this diagonal. And also, now that the queen has vacated the d-file, Black can't really develop. The knight on d7 is just stuck. Or the knight on b8 is stuck and can't go to d7. And again, if a6 to try and free yourself, I go a4. And the same problem exists even in this position where this knight can't seem to get off the 8th rank. And so that is a huge, huge problem and a big part of the reason why white is a lot better. So, yeah, so it's just a really tough spot to be in. And unfortunately for Max, he kind of crumbled here because after bishop takes c4, he went e6. And e6 to me just seemed really, really suspicious because, again, he's still super undeveloped. And I'm not a tactician, but I do know that when you're playing with an isolated pawn like I have on d4, I have to play for the initiative to offset my structural deficit. And so it didn't take me too long to see that knight takes f7 should be winning and, promising, and at the very least promising, and probably winning. And I went for this with a little hesitation because now after knight takes f7 and rook takes f7, bishop takes e6, I have 2 pawns for the piece. Black is completely tied down, and I'm just so active here. It's just a huge problem. So yeah, and it turns out the position is just totally winning for white. Now, Black went queen f6, trying to protect the f7 rook, and I have to be a little bit careful here because if I try to take on f7 right away, this would be ill-advised. White. The reason to be ill-advised is because now Black can mobilize, get the knight to d7, get the rook to c8, and having the 2 pieces for the rook and 2 pawns, the 2 pieces would actually start to factor more because one of my extra pawns is this isolated d pawn that isn't very strong anyway. So, and then the 3 versus 2 is not something I can, easily take advantage of and mobilize. So actually, this would not be what I would want to do to try and trade queens and get to this endgame because I don't believe white is much better. Instead, though, because Black is pinned, I can add more pressure. And one of the things I also noticed is that this knight on b8 still can't move because if you go to d7, I just snap it off and there's still a pin on f7. So I realized I can add more fuel to the fire, and I did that by playing rook a c1. And the idea is simple. Now, if I clear my bishop from this square, my rook can invade on c7 with decisive effect because this pin is a problem. Additionally, in some lines, I'm actually threatening d5, just, unleashing bishop takes g7 and rook c7 check. And basically, in a lot of lines, the issue is that tactically, now I can consider trading on f7 in a lot of lines because when the rook comes to c7 with check, I hit the bishop on b7 and just actually become up in a full exchange. So because of this, there's just no good way to deal with it. Black now went bishop h6, trying to challenge my rook on c1, and maybe to consider unpinning himself with king g7, but this just doesn't work because now I have the move bishop d2. And it's a really, really nice piece sacrifice, and I normally don't play this energetically, but it's actually not even hard because now after bishop takes d2 is played, I have rook c7, and even though I'm temporarily 2 pieces down, I'm getting so much of this material back with interest, and the position just completely collapses because this knight on b8 and this rook on a8 were just stuck the entire game. Black now went knight d7, jettisoning the knight and giving 1 piece back. And now I just went rook takes d7, and again, the pin on f7 still exists, the bishop on b7 is still hanging, and yeah, there's just a huge problem here. After rook takes d7, black went bishop c8, and now I just went bishop takes f7 check, and I'm just up a full exchange. Black went king g7, and I was a bit, annoyed here that black hadn't already resigned, but that's the other thing when you're playing young players. Typically, they play more moves than they should, or at least they just don't resign when they normally should. They play more moves. I don't know. Sometimes play till checkmate, which is kind of annoying, but it is what it is. And now I thought for a little while and was just trying to figure out the cleanest way to finish him off, and I think I found it. I went rook c7 first, just bring my rook to the side, and I'm still in a full exchange up and multiple pawns up. And after bishop f4, challenging my rook on c7, now I went rook fc1. And my point was that I'm willing to give the exchange back if it means that I'm still 2 pawns up with a massive advantage, and I'm also threatening all types of discoveries on the 7th rank. After bishop c7, rook takes c7, Max went queen takes d4, and it's kind of funny because in a position where I'm just totally dominating, he did at least manage to threaten mate in 1 or mate in 2 with queen a1 mate being a threat. But I finished off the game fairly efficiently with checks here, and it wasn't super complicated. In fact, why don't you pause the video and try to figure out the most precise way to finish the game. All right, hopefully you didn't think too long over this. It's not super complicated, but the move I played was bishop g8 check. And this move is nice because it doesn't allow the king to go back to h8, because now if you go king h8, there's the very nifty rook h7 checkmate. So the king has to step out into the wild, and unfortunately there's no saving the king here. It's just completely naked. So king h6 was played, and now, again, I'm just playing with check, so I just went rook takes h7 check, king g5, h4 check, very nice check, now giving my king an escape square in case I kind of need to make a move without check. Now at least my king is safe. And after king f6, rook f7 check, and now king e5, and now queen g3 check. And here, 1 move away from mate, my opponent resigned. Note that if king d5, well, I think there is a very beautiful mate here with a rook f5 mate. And what do you know? It's a double discovery mate. Oh, actually, it's not mate. The king can go to e4. All right, so it's almost double discovery mate, but the king can go to e4, and then I have queen f3 mate. And, well, this king was on the run for quite a while. It's not so surprising it gets caught in the middle of the board. But after queen g3 check, my opponent resigned. Interesting game, just from the standpoint of, The Grunfeld is always an interesting line, and maybe you might find this sideline to be appealing. I'm not so sure I'm going to repeat this very often because I didn't feel like it got much out of the opening, and it seemed like Black could liquidate in the center a little bit too quickly. But I was glad that it worked out in this game. And it was interesting how the position changed from being like a strategic kind of positional Grunfeld to all of a sudden an attacking game with the isolated pawn. And I hope you can kind of see how the activity of the piece activity of white really compensated for the isolated pawn, and playing with that initiative was actually what won me the game. So this actually is not typically the style I play in, attacking like this, but I was happy to get the W in this one. All right, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and/or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, please do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.